everyone, and welcome to episode 5. We'll be taking a short detour from figure painting and looking at some rust and chip paint effects that I'm working on with the model that's currently on my desk. I'm working on a M54 truck, Vietnam era truck, and for this I applied some rust and chip paint effects to some of the lower chassis components. I followed a specific set of steps to achieve this look, and I thought to share it with everyone. The first step is of course assembly and a rust primer. Next I'll be using a sponge technique to apply different rust and metal colors. We'll be sealing that in with a durable clear coat from Microscale, applying a chipping medium from Vallejo. Next is an acrylic base coat, and then finally we'll be using a kitchen scourer to do the physical paint chipping. It's very important when you assemble the different chassis components to make sure that you remove all the flash. Any imperfections that slips through will be visible in the paint later on, and of course we don't want that. The primer that I'll be using is a rust colored primer from AK. This is an acrylic primer. This needs to be applied in a very even coat across all the axles and the different chassis components that we'll be painting. Using the airbrush for this. We're also painting the bumper, a very visible part of our model, and making sure that we get an even coat of rust primer on this as well. And there we go, everything now received a very even primer coat, and it's ready to move on to the next stage. Let's take a look at the tools. I'll be using a sponge, an ordinary kitchen scourer. I find a used one works best for this purpose. And then also some acrylic colors, some light rust, some dark rust, as well as natural steel. I can share one tip. For scrap paper, I use cash register paper, these rolls. You can buy them in bulk, throw them away afterwards. It works very well on the hobby bench for this purpose. We need a small amount of paint for the sponge technique, the different colors. First up is the steel. We just need a little bit of this. The light rust acrylic, I'm using these colors from Vallejo for this purpose. Just squeeze out a little bit of paint, and then of course also the dark rust color. We'll be starting with the dark rust first. Guys, you can use any other rust colors that you have available. I've used some lighter ones, some more yellower ones. In this case I found that these three colors work best. Now using the sponge, pick up a little bit of paint, remove as much of it as possible. It's very similar to the dry brushing technique. The idea is to create irregular patterns all over this axle. So what I'll do is apply some paint, rotate the axle, rotate the sponge. Don't worry if you get too much of one color in one area. We'll be breaking this up with the lighter rust color next. Also remember to do the same on the bumper, and pay special attention to the edges, which will receive the most chipping later on. There we go, this should be enough to cover the bumper, and we're ready to move on to the next color. You'll see on this axle there was a little bit too much dark paint on the center section there, and we'll fix that with some of the lighter rust color. Again, pick up a little paint with a sponge, remove most of it on the scrap paper, and now start applying this lighter color to sections that are too dark. Again, make sure that you cover the entire axle, making sure to pay special attention to any of the edges that we'll be chipping later on. Getting a wide variety of rust shades all over the surface. And there you go, this is now 3 different shades of rust applied to this axle, and all that it requires next is some metal color. For this we'll be using natural steel, Vallejo acrylic. Use a different sponge. And we need a very small amount of paint now, making sure that you remove as much as possible from the sponge. And now start dabbing this onto the axle. Again, paying special attention to the edges. You'll see that we're getting a very realistic effect now. It's looking very much like a rusted surface that you'll find in a scrapyard or a workshop. And here you can see how much of a difference the metal color makes. Next up is the bumper. Again, pay special attention to the edges. This is the areas that we will be chipping on later on. Applying the metal paint all over these areas. This is the truck flatbed. I used the same technique on this. For this, I kept a reference picture close by and made sure that I get the exact same look. And the sponge technique is very effective for this. Guys, again, we'll be using a kitchen scourer on these components later, so it's very important that you protect the paint. I like to use microscales varnishes for this. In addition to clear coats, they also act like hardeners, which is essential for this application. For the physical chipping, I'll be using Vallejo's chipping medium. It's a water-based product. And once I figured out how to properly use this product, chipping just became so much easier. I use a ratio of 1 part chipping medium and 2 parts water. In this case, 4 drops of chipping medium and then 8 drops of ordinary tap water. And in this case, I make sure to count each drop so that the ratio that I've tried and tested gets applied to the model. Very important part is to mix this properly before loading your airbrush with it. This is now applied in a very even coat to the axles and all the other different components that we will be painting, making sure that you don't miss any spots. And there we go. This is now ready to move on to the next stage, which is the base coat. In this case, we'll be using Vallejo's US Olive Drab. And this is loaded into the airbrush and applied to the axle. Don't worry if you perhaps miss a spot or two. A little bit of rust primer shining through the base coat will actually help us to achieve the effect that we're after. This is also applied to the bumper, making sure that we apply this very evenly on the front, the top and the back. For weathering, I make sure that I have reference pictures of the real thing available. In this case, pictures from workshops as well as scrapyards. These pictures tell me exactly where to apply just the right amount of rust so that I don't go overboard. Some of the best advice I was ever given when it comes to weathering is to stop before you think it's enough. It's very easy to go overboard, but when you have a reference picture nearby that shows you the real thing, it helps you to stay in the realm of reality. For this technique, we'll be needing some water, an ordinary household kitchen scourer. You find this in any supermarket, and I find a used one works best. We'll also need some wooden toothpicks for those hard to reach spaces. A hard bristled brush. This is a regular brush that I just cut the bristle shorter. And then a regular brush which we'll use to moisten the component. At first, apply just a little bit of water and then do the chipping to see how much of the base coat you're removing. You can rather build the effect up in layers. It's very easy to go overboard and remove too much paint. Approach this very carefully, looking at your reference pictures, making sure that you remove paint in the correct places, paying special attention to the edges where the most abrasion will happen in the real world. For hard to reach spaces where the kitchen scourer won't reach, I use the hard bristled brush just to remove the paint from the top of those screws. In the real world, they'll be susceptible to the biggest amount of rust. And there we have it, the finished components. These are now ready to go into the chassis, and they've got a very realistic look to them. There are a few more other components that we also need to add, some drive shafts, etc. And I'll be covering those in the next video that looks at oil and grease effects. This is a list of all the products that I'll be using in this tutorial and the next. some surface primers, acrylic paints, and chipping mediums amongst others. Guys, as always, follow me on Instagram. You can follow this entire build step by step there with pictures. And I'll be seeing you in the next video.